while incarcerated, the inmate that I was housed with in a room was a self-professed devil worshiper. And he's the one who told me how to get a Bible just so he could show me how he could tear it to shreds. And while reading it, I was terrified because I knew I was a sinner. I was in jail for a reason.
Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a very, very special guest, Anthony Rogers, a highly respected theologian who defends both Jewish and Gentile faith in Jesus. Anthony, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So you became a believer in Jesus while you were incarcerated a lifetime ago, so to speak, right?
Yeah. So 30 years ago, back in 1993, I grew up on the streets of Southern California, got in a lot of trouble, and it was there that the Lord apprehended me. I would say like Jonah, except Jonah wasn't per se living a wayward life prior to his being called to go to Nineveh, but he certainly was wayward at the time of his calling. But in any case, the Lord apprehended me there, and ever since then, I've served Him and loved to serve Him and loved Him in serving Him.
Amazing. Well, we'll get into that in a minute. Just to be clear, you're now a pastor of prison ministries, yes?
Yes. Since I was converted in that context, I had nothing but a desire to go back in and see who else would respond to the call.
Makes sense. It's great. And so just so the audience is clear, you're not Jewish, yet
No.
your wife is Jewish, yes?
Yes.
And she's also a believer in Jesus.
Yes.
Amazing. And you have 4 children.
Yes.
So according to halacha, or Jewish law, your children are actually Jewish.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I hear my kids talking to others how they identify. They always say they're Jewish, when they think in terms of their ethnicity, which is interesting to me. I'm Sicilian, so they primarily identify with their Jewish side, I guess.
That's cool. So I'm a street evangelist here in Israel, and it's a pretty tough crowd, which is why I spend a lot of time studying about the Messiah in the Old Testament. AKA Tanakh, in order to make, a solid defense for Jesus from the Hebrew Scriptures, because most Jewish people and most Israelis especially don't necessarily want to hear from the New Testament. And so when I've seen your work and I've studied some of your teachings, you have a very deep, in-depth knowledge of Scripture. And as you know, there are many things that Jews just accept. Jesus isn't for the Jews. God is one, or in other words, numerically one or singular, and the Tanakh gives no message or even hint of a triune God or Trinity. Another one is passages like Numbers 23:19 that says God is not a man, that he should lie. He's not a human being that he should change his mind, or the son of man that he should change his mind. And these passages are used to argue that God hasn't and wouldn't appear as a man. Yet you give sound biblical evidence and proof from the Tanakh to show the opposite of all these claims. And that's really why I wanted to have you on here. And I'm really excited to jump into these episodes. But the first thing I want to address is, how did you and your Jewish wife come to faith in Jesus?
Yeah, so I can be quick with my own conversion. I already said that I was running around on the streets. I eventually got in trouble for stealing a car. And while incarcerated, it was actually quite providential. The inmate that I was housed with in a room was a self-professed devil worshiper. And this guy had an axe to grind against the Bible, so he kept attacking it, which was quite strange because I had no interest in the Bible at that point. And he's the one who told me how to get a Bible just so he could show me how he could tear it to shreds. And we got it, and he couldn't show me what he claimed. And then I had all this time on my hands, so I started reading it. And while reading it, I was terrified because I knew I was a sinner. I was in jail for a reason. I had no excuse. I knew that I chose these things without any justification for them. And it terrified me. And it wasn't until I heard somebody proclaim the gospel of Christ, that he was the atoning sacrifice for my sins, that God freely accepts me in his Son, and forgives my sins on his account, that I turned to him in faith, and everything changed for me right there. Well, I got out a few years later, and I started working. I was still in my early 20s. I started working at a pizza parlor, and there was a young Jewish girl working the counter. I was a delivery guy, so I would go in and out, taking pizzas out to customers and coming back. And every time I'd come back, she'd ask me a question. She'd tell me something her rabbi said. She'd say, he said this about Jesus, and she had this question, and he didn't really have an answer to that. And, she wasn't asking questions to refute her rabbi or anything like that. She just was curious. And so I would give her answers, and I almost got used to coming in expecting a question. So I would come in with the pizza or without the pizza. The job was to get rid of it. But I'd come in and she'd ask me a question, and I was like, wow, she's just so inquisitive. And eventually I said, hey, you ought to come to church. Now, here's the really interesting thing. Our church at the time was looking for a new building. We were growing and needed a new facility. And it so happened that a Jewish group was selling a temple that they used for High Holy Days. So they had various synagogues they'd meet in weekly, but during High Holy Days, they'd go to this particular synagogue. This was in Las Vegas. It was called Temple Bet Shalom. And they had just purchased it. So the first time my wife-to-be came to this church, she said, I used to come here for High Holy Days.
Wow.
This was a familiar place. And they still had a lot of the stuff on the buildings. On the building, they had, the doors were like these huge doors that were ornate. They had all sorts of interesting things in them. There was a replica of the burning bush out front. No image of God, of course, just the idea of a bush on fire but not being consumed, and all sorts of things. A tree of life inside showing who had dedicated what or contributed what to the building of this temple.
Right.
And so anyway, she came to the church. She heard the message preached, and I don't know how many Sundays it was, but over the course of a couple of Sundays, and this was after we had spoken a lot, she finally, she came to believe. And what was interesting to me, it was actually eye-opening to me, her family didn't erupt at that point. It wasn't until she was baptized. Once she was baptized, that blew the lid off everything, and they all wanted to come at me and ask me questions. And it was interesting because a lot of them weren't really believing or practicing the Jewish faith.
Right.
But suddenly they were very Jewish at this moment when she professed her faith in the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me go back a little bit. How you were in jail, and you said, this is when everything changed for me. What changed in you?
So one of the things that bothered me as I was reading the Bible and I'm incarcerated is I see that God is holy. I know that I'm sinful. And I was listening to other prisoners explain why they got there and how this was, in some sense, justified. They didn't necessarily say their crime was okay, but they were trying to explain in a way that pacified their consciences or something. And I would listen to these things looking for my own excuse. So I'd hear somebody say, I came from a broken family. And then I thought to myself, oh, well, I didn't come from a broken family. And I know people that did, and they didn't commit crimes to come here. So even if that were the case, it wouldn't be a good excuse. Then I heard somebody say, oh, we were poor, so we had to steal and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, no, I wasn't poor. I had anything I needed. I was like Adam in the garden, right? And somebody came offering me a fruit and I took it. It was just the desire to sin. And so that bothered me. Then I heard somebody say they came from a bad area, and all this could just be multiplied. Everything they said, I could think through and say, no, that doesn't apply in my case. And I know people in all these scenarios that didn't commit crimes. So it terrified me. And I'm reading the Bible and I'm thinking, what hope do I have that I can be forgiven? And I read not only of a God who's holy and angry with the wicked, but who's boundless in his grace and his loving kindness. And so when the whole world deserved to perish, we're told that Noah received grace in the eyes of the Lord, it says in Genesis 6. And I saw that sort of thing countless times over. After finally hearing the gospel, I saw that all these judgments also had within them some evidence of God's grace. And I saw that this was the trajectory of the whole Bible, that this is pointing to what God is going to do. And when I saw this, it was like a huge weight fell from off of me. I perceived my guilt to be gone. And that by itself was a huge change. The removal of guilt is not itself an inward change, but it has implications now, right? But it wasn't by itself. Scripture teaches not only that God removes your guilt, but that he does change you inwardly. Right. I'm just saying that these are two different things, and this has a huge impact, though, even on your thinking. It was overwhelming to me that God had forgiven my sins and that he did so at his own cost. And I thought, what love is this, and how do I properly respond to it? And so then when you consider he also changes the heart, that's the whole point of the Old Testament, what it's pointing to. Moses in Deuteronomy 10 said that the people didn't have circumcised hearts, so the circumcision of the flesh was pointing to the need for something which they lacked. And then in Deuteronomy 30, he promised that God would do this for them in the future. The prophets pick up on this. Jeremiah 31 especially says that God's going to make a new covenant, and it will surpass the old. And part of the provision of this new covenant is the circumcision of the heart. He'll take your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. So that's what happened for me. And it was wondrous. And I was overjoyed and still am overjoyed.
Right? 30 years later. So your wife, you managed to be a part of leading your wife to faith in Jesus, as we call him here in Israel, Yeshua. What was her, what changed in her from before to after?
Yeah, so most of what I knew about her was our interactions at the restaurant. But this was a lot. I would, it was day in, day out sort of thing. And there were a few occasions when I was around for other events. She was actually very active at her synagogue. They had a youth group for young men, but not for girls. B'nai B'rit Youth Organization is what they called it, BBYO. And then she created a chapter for girls. And they had some events for these things. And a couple of times she invited me to them. And I think it was so that she could ask questions and also get other people to ask me questions or interact or something. She was just really, really interested in knowing about Jesus. It was interesting to me because I would pursue people trying to tell them about Jesus.
Right.
They didn't want to hear, but she's here asking me, and I thought this is the best thing ever. And so she had a very inquisitive nature about these things, but also she's a young girl in her teens, 16, 17, 18 over this period of time. And so she was just fun-loving and very excitable and that sort of thing. So she didn't have a dour attitude or anything that changed afterwards. But once she heard of Christ, she was amazed, thinking, how is all this right here in the scriptures? And I didn't see it.
There you go. Yeah.
And she thought, how do others not see this? It was an oddity to her that she didn't know, but then she could think, well, I don't know it as well as they do, the Old Testament, but she could clearly see it. So it was the sort of thing where, they're the rabbis and so forth, but I see it right here. And it kind of reminds me of, I like watching judge shows, and there's a judge on TV who she'll look at stuff and she'll have pictures and she'll have audio, and the person will be saying the contrary to what she has in front of her. And she says, who should I believe, you or my lying eyes? Right. In other words, are my eyes really the culprits here, or are you? Because I've got the evidence. And so my wife was kind of in that position. She's looking at the Bible saying, well, it's right here. And to give you a little story, and I know you've heard this countless times over, but I think I heard it from a Jewish group a long time ago, and I used it with my father-in-law. he was over our house one day. We used to have a lot of debates and things, and he wasn't a practicing Jewish individual, but had something of a Jewish upbringing. And anyways, one day he came over and I read to him Isaiah 52 through 53, 52:13 through 53:12. And I just said, Dave, his name's David, good Jewish name. I said, Dave, can I read to you something? I just want your honest reaction to it. I don't have much to say in response. I just want your reaction to it. I didn't tell him where I was reading it from. I read it, and he said, oh, yeah. He goes, yeah, I don't believe that. And I said, what do you mean you don't believe that? And he said, I'm Jewish. And I said, well, Dave, I said, you don't really practice Judaism, but I understand, you're Jewish, and after a manner of speaking, you're ethnically Jewish. But I think that obligates you to believe this. That doesn't absolve you from believing this. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, you're obligated to believe this. He goes, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe that. And I told him, I said, Dave, this is from the prophet Isaiah. It was written 700 years before Jesus came on the scene. And his jaw just dropped and hung there. And I almost want to say it's been hanging there to this day. He hasn't yet confessed faith, but he knows that that text caught him dead to rights. And
it was a right hook. Yeah. Wow. Amazing. Yeah. And so you and your wife have been walking together with your family in faith for many years now. How long?
Yeah, 30 years. Or well, I say 30 years. That's when I was converted.
Yeah.
We were married in 2001.
Uh-huh.
So we've been married about 23 years.
Yeah. Beautiful story. Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And where can people find you, study you, follow your work?
I have a YouTube page under my name, Anthony Rogers. So if they're interested in anything that I'm doing, they can find it there. Sometimes I do other stuff around the internet, including here with you, but other people as well. And so I can be found on other channels as well. But the main channel would be my own, Anthony Rogers.
Great. I'll link that down in the description. So I want to thank you for being here, and thank you all for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the Jews for Jesus YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And, just subscribe for more. And, thanks once again, Anthony Rogers, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Take care.